Imagine buying a superpower for the price of a cup of coffee per acre. Imagine purchasing the future dominance of the globe for less money than a modern billionaire spends on a yacht. The United States of America did not conquer the West with gunpowder. It bought it at a pawn shop because a French dictator was broke. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. We are taught in our history books that the Louisiana Purchase was a stroke of diplomatic genius. We are told that President Thomas Jefferson had the foresight to expand the nation from sea to shining sea. We see paintings of Robert Livingston and James Monroe signing a treaty in Paris, and we celebrate it as the moment the United States became a continental giant. But this is not a story about American genius. This is a story about French desperation.
It is a story about a financial hole so deep that it forced the greatest conqueror in modern history to sell his own future for pennies. It is the story of how a mosquito and a banking ledger destroyed the dream of a French North America. To understand the magnitude of this sale, we have to look at the map of the world in the year 1800. The United States was a small, fragile republic huddled along the Atlantic coast. To the west lay a massive territory that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains.
This was Louisiana. It was not just the modern state of Louisiana. It was the heart of the North American continent. It covered millions of acres of the most fertile soil on earth. It included the entire Missouri and Arkansas River valleys. It was the breadbasket of the future. And it belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was not content with ruling Europe. He had a vision of a global empire. He wanted to restore the French presence in the Americas that had been lost a generation earlier during the 7 Years' War. He looked at the map, and he saw a grand geometric plan. The center of this plan was not New Orleans. It was the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, which we know today as Haiti. Saint-Domingue was the jewel of the French Empire. It was the most profitable colony in the world. It produced 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in Europe. It was a money-printing machine fueled by the brutal labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. Napoleon's plan was simple and economically brilliant. Saint-Domingue would produce the sugar and cash. The vast territory of Louisiana would produce the food and timber to feed Saint-Domingue. The Mississippi River would be the supply artery for the Caribbean Empire. Louisiana was the farm, and Haiti was the factory. Together they would make France independent of British trade and wealthier than any nation on earth. In 1800, Napoleon secretly forced Spain to give Louisiana back to France. The Spanish were weak, and they had no choice. The deal was done in the shadows. The French flag was ready to rise over the Mississippi again. Thomas Jefferson in Washington was terrified. As long as the decaying Spanish Empire held New Orleans, the Americans felt safe. But if the aggressive, dynamic Napoleon controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, the United States would be choked. The farmers in Ohio and Kentucky relied on the river to export their goods. If Napoleon closed the river, the American economy would collapse. Jefferson famously wrote that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. He was preparing for war. He knew that the United States could not survive with a French superpower on its western border. But the war that destroyed Napoleon's American dream did not happen on the Mississippi. It happened in the sugar fields of Haiti. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue had risen up in revolution led by the brilliant General Toussaint Louverture. They had declared their freedom. Napoleon could not abide this. He needed the sugar profits to fund his wars in Europe, and he needed the colony under control to make his Louisiana plan work. Without Haiti, there was no need for Louisiana. So in 1801, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with a massive army to crush the rebellion and restore slavery. It was one of the largest expeditions France had ever launched. Tens of thousands of the finest soldiers in Europe sailed across the Atlantic. They expected a quick victory against a ragtag army of former slaves. They walked into a slaughterhouse. The Haitian armies fought with a ferocity and brilliance that stunned the French. They burned the cities to the ground rather than surrender them. They fought a guerrilla war in the mountains. But the French army faced an enemy even more deadly than the Haitian muskets. They faced the yellow fever. The mosquito-borne virus tore through the French ranks. It was a biological catastrophe. Soldiers would fall ill in the morning, vomiting black blood, and be dead by the evening. The hospitals were overflowing with dying men. General Leclerc himself caught the fever and died. In less than 2 years, France lost more than 50,000 soldiers in Haiti. It was a higher casualty rate than any battle in the Napoleonic Wars. The expedition was wiped out. The sugar colony was lost forever. The engine of Napoleon's American empire had exploded. Back in Paris, Napoleon received the reports. He was furious. He smashed porcelain vases against the wall. He realized that the grand geometric plan was dead. If he didn't have Haiti, he didn't need the food from Louisiana. The vast territory in North America was no longer a strategic asset. It was a liability, and then the situation got worse. The Peace of Amiens, which had paused the war between France and Britain, was breaking down. Everyone knew that war was about to start again. Napoleon looked at the strategic reality. The British Royal Navy ruled the oceans. France had a powerful army, but its navy was weak. Louisiana was thousands of miles away across an ocean controlled by British warships. The moment war was declared, the British would send a fleet to New Orleans. They would sail up the Mississippi and take the territory for free. Napoleon had no troops to defend it because they had all died in Haiti. He realized he was about to lose Louisiana to the British and get nothing in return. And then there was the money. France was broke. The expedition to Haiti had cost a fortune. The preparations for the invasion of England were draining the treasury. Napoleon needed cash. He needed to buy muskets. He needed to build ships. He needed to pay his soldiers. He was sitting on a massive real estate asset that he couldn't defend, and he had bills to pay today. This is the mindset of a desperate debtor. When you are drowning in debt and facing a crisis, you do not look at the long-term value of your assets. You look at their liquidity. You ask yourself, what can I sell today to survive until tomorrow? Napoleon decided to liquidate the empire. In Washington, President Jefferson had no idea that Napoleon's dreams were collapsing. He was still terrified of a French invasion. He sent James Monroe to Paris with instructions to buy the city of New Orleans. He authorized Monroe to offer up to $10 million for the city, and perhaps the immediate surrounding area of Florida. Jefferson just wanted to secure the port. He wanted to keep the river open. He never dreamed of buying the whole continent. James Monroe arrived in Paris in April of 1803. He met with Robert Livingston, the American ambassador. They went to see the French finance minister, François Barbé-Marbois. They prepared to argue and haggle just to get a small piece of land at the mouth of the river. But the French minister shocked them. He asked a simple question. How much will you give us for the whole thing? Livingston and Monroe were stunned. They asked what he meant by the whole thing. He meant everything, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. From the Mississippi to the Rockies, the entire Louisiana Territory. The Americans couldn't believe their ears. They had come to buy a garage, and they were being offered a mansion. But they hesitated. They didn't have the authority to buy a continent. Their instructions were clear. Buy New Orleans. If they spent millions more than authorized, they could be impeached. But they also knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They knew that if they went back to Washington to ask for permission, the deal might disappear. Napoleon was volatile. He might change his mind. The British might invade. So they started to negotiate the price. Napoleon wanted money for war. He didn't want IOUs. He wanted gold. The final price was set at $15 million. Let's pause and look at that number. $15 million. In modern terms, that sounds like nothing. Even adjusted for inflation, it is a tiny sum for a territory that doubled the size of the United States. The territory was approximately 828,000 square miles. That is roughly 530 million acres. If you do the math, $15 million divided by 530 million acres comes out to less than 3 cents an acre. 3 cents. Napoleon sold the future breadbasket of the world. He sold the iron mines of Minnesota. He sold the wheat fields of Kansas. He sold the oil beneath the ground in Oklahoma. He sold the strategic depth that would allow the United States to become a superpower, and he sold it for the price of a scrap of paper. But there is another layer to this financial tragedy. The United States didn't actually have $15 million in gold lying around. The young republic was cash poor. They had to borrow the money to pay Napoleon. And who did they borrow it from? They borrowed it from the British. The financing of the Louisiana Purchase was handled by the banking houses of Baring Brothers in London and Hope and Company in Amsterdam. These were the titans of international finance. Think about the irony. Napoleon was selling Louisiana because he needed money to go to war with Britain. The United States bought Louisiana by borrowing money from British bankers. The British bankers facilitated the deal knowing that the cash would go straight into Napoleon's war chest to fight their own country. Why would they do that? Because banks don't care about flags. They care about interest. The Barings knew that the United States was a good credit risk. They knew they would make a fortune on the bonds. So they financed the enemy of their own government because the deal was too good to pass up. On the other side, Napoleon took the money and burned it. $15 million was a lot of money, but war is the most expensive human activity. The money from the Louisiana Purchase was spent almost immediately. It went into the preparations for the invasion of England. Napoleon built thousands of barges and landing craft at the camp of Boulogne. He equipped a massive army that stared across the English Channel. But that invasion never happened. The French Navy was defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar. The barges rotted in the harbor. The money was wasted. Napoleon had traded a continent for a failed military campaign. It is the definition of a bad investment. He sacrificed a permanent asset for a temporary tactical advantage. If Napoleon had held on to Louisiana, history would be unrecognizable. The United States would have remained a second-tier power trapped on the East Coast. North America would have been divided between the U.S., the British in Canada, and the French in the center. The rise of the American economic colossus would have been impossible without the resources of the Midwest. Napoleon later regretted the decision. As he sat in exile on the lonely island of St. Helena, he looked back on his life. He reportedly said that he had given England a maritime rival that would sooner or later humble her pride. He was trying to spin the sail as a strategic move to hurt Britain in the long run. But in the moment, it wasn't strategy. It was bankruptcy. The Louisiana Purchase teaches us a brutal lesson about the nature of power. Military genius is useless without financial stability. Napoleon was the greatest general of his age, but he was a terrible financial manager. He viewed economics as a boring necessity, not a strategic weapon. He didn't understand that land is the ultimate store of value. He treated territory like a poker chip to be cashed in when he was short on funds. On the other hand, the United States, despite being a weak military power, understood the value of the deal. Jefferson had constitutional doubts about buying the land. He wasn't sure if the Constitution allowed the federal government to acquire territory. But he put those doubts aside because the economic logic was overwhelming. The Americans understood that the real wealth of nations is not gold in a vault. It is land, it is soil, it is rivers. It is the capacity for future growth. When the American flag was raised over New Orleans in December of 1803, it marked the end of the European struggle for North America. The French were gone. The Spanish were fading. The British were locked in the north. The continent was open. The settlers poured across the Mississippi. They didn't know about the banking deals in London or the yellow fever in Haiti. They just saw open land. They brought their plows and their cattle. They built towns and cities. Within a few generations, the territory that Napoleon sold for 3 cents an acre was producing more wealth every single year than the entire French Empire had produced in its history. The wheat from Kansas fed the world. The corn from Iowa fattened the livestock. The Mississippi River became the busiest commercial waterway on the planet. Napoleon had sold the engine of the 20th century for $15 million. This transaction is often called the greatest real estate deal in history, but that phrasing gives too much credit to the buyer. A deal implies two willing parties trading value. This was not a deal. This was a foreclosure. Napoleon had overextended himself. He had leveraged his empire to the hilt. And when the margin call came in the form of a fever in Haiti and a fleet in Britain, he had to liquidate his best asset to cover his position. It is a warning to every leader and every nation. You can have the grandest vision in the world. You can have the bravest soldiers. But if your balance sheet is broken, you will eventually be forced to sell your future to pay for your past. The quiet decay of the French Empire began in the counting houses of Paris when they realized they couldn't afford to hold the world. It ended with the stroke of a pen that transferred the heart of a continent to a rival republic. We walk through the cities of St. Louis and New Orleans, and we see the French names on the streets. We see the fleur-de-lis symbols. They are the ghosts of an empire that went broke. They are the remnants of a dream that was sold for copper coins. The next time you look at a map of the United States and see the massive expanse of the middle of the country, remember the price tag: 3 cents. It serves as a permanent monument to the fact that in the game of empires, cash is king, and debt is the killer of dreams. Napoleon conquered Europe, but he couldn't conquer his own ledger, and that failure created the world we live in today. The American superpower was born not in the fires of the Revolution, but in the ashes of the French treasury. It was the ultimate fire sale, and we are still living with the consequences of that 3-cent mistake.